Welcome to the Indigenous Navigator survey module on human rights and environmental due diligence and Indigenous peoples' rights. Human rights and environmental due diligence, or HREDD, is the process by which companies identify, meaning to conduct a comprehensive assessment of operations, supply chains, and business relationships on human rights risks. Prevent, meaning to take proactive measures to avoid causing or contributing to risks identified above. Mitigate, meaning to reduce the severity or likelihood of negative impacts when prevention is not fully possible. And account for the actual and potential negative impacts on human rights as well as the environment, meaning to ensure transparency and responsibility by tracking, reporting, and communicating how human rights and environmental risks are addressed. In this process, it is important to consider actual and potential negative impacts. This includes harms that have already occurred as a result of a company's activities, products, or business relationships, as well as harms that could occur in the future if not properly managed or addressed. An example for an actual negative human rights impact could be that a community is forcibly displaced due to land acquisition for a mining project. Meanwhile, a potential negative human rights impact could be caused by the expansion of business activities into a region with weak labor laws, which could result in exploitation. This responsibility of companies is proactive and ongoing. Proactive means that HREDD should not only happen for the sake of responding to media or NGO reports, but rather be done systematically and regularly in the course of business. Ongoing means that HREDD does not only take place before a business relationship is established or before a project is initiated. Rather, it is something that happens on an ongoing basis and in the context of projects throughout the life cycle of a project. HREDD applies across a company's operations and value chain. This means that direct business relationships, such as suppliers, and indirect business relationships, such as the suppliers of a supplier, are concerned. Business relationships both upstream and downstream of the company are covered, meaning both related to activities that occur before a product reaches a company or the service that feeds into a company's activities, and those that occur after the product leaves the company's direct control, all the way from raw materials sourcing to end use and product end of life. HREDD builds on the concept of human rights due diligence, or HRDD, introduced in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or UNGPs, which we will look into now. The UN system has recognized that business activities can seriously affect human rights, especially for those in vulnerable situations, including indigenous peoples. States have a duty to prevent and remedy these harms, and businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights in all their operations. This is outlined in the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, known as the UNGPs, and endorsed by the UN Human Rights Council in 2011. The UNGPs are built on three key pillars. 1. The state duty to protect human rights. States must take steps to prevent and respond to human rights abuses by businesses. For example, a government should require companies to obtain free, prior, and informed consent, known as FPIC, from indigenous communities before approving a mining project on their land. 2. The corporate responsibility to respect human rights. Businesses must avoid causing or contributing to human rights harms and must act responsibly throughout their operations. For instance, a company building a pipeline should assess the potential impacts on indigenous lands and cultural heritage and take steps to avoid or mitigate harm. 3. Access to remedy. People affected by business-related harms must have access to justice and effective remedies. For example, if an indigenous community is displaced by a development project, they should be able to seek compensation or land restitution through a fair and accessible process. In 2017, the UN Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights reinforced this principle in General Comment number 24 on state obligations in the context of business activities, which emphasizes that states must regulate business conduct both at home and abroad, ensure non-discrimination, and provide effective remedies. Other frameworks, like the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, also highlight the importance of indigenous peoples' rights. They call on companies to pay special attention to groups at heightened risk, including indigenous peoples, when conducting human rights and environmental due diligence. Understanding these frameworks is essential. Understanding these frameworks allows indigenous peoples to know their rights, but also to gain insight into the legal obligations of states and the responsibilities of businesses. When these obligations are not upheld, the rights of indigenous peoples are abused or violated. In this video, we will give you an overview of key international instruments related to human rights and environmental due diligence, and a look at national laws and policies that should be reviewed when assessing the impacts of business activities on indigenous peoples. Before we dive into key instruments, let us look at a few key concepts. A human rights violation is a breach of legally binding obligations, typically committed by states and confirmed through judicial or quasi-judicial processes. A human rights abuse may be committed by non-state actors, such as businesses, and involves actions or omissions that infringe on human rights. Human rights harms refer to adverse impacts on individuals or communities resulting from business activities or policies. These harms may not meet the legal threshold of an abuse or violation, but are still critical to identify and address through human rights and environmental due diligence, or HREDD, processes. Key instruments related to preventing and addressing the adverse impacts of business activities on human rights. The module on human rights and environmental due diligence often refers to the standards and obligations set out in key instruments related to the matter. We have already been introduced to the first key instrument, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, or UNGPs. While they are not legally binding, the UNGPs have been broadly endorsed, and their principles have been embedded in other frameworks articulating responsible business conduct. According to the UNGPs, states have an obligation to put in place effective policy and regulatory environment that ensure that business respects human rights and provide victims of abuses and harms related to business activities access to remedy. This means that states are expected to set clear expectations for businesses by establishing laws, policies, and regulations that make it clear that businesses are expected to respect human rights in all of their operations, both at home and abroad. This includes requiring companies to conduct human rights due diligence, which means identifying, preventing, and addressing any negative impacts they might cause or contribute to. Ensure effectiveness. It is not enough to just have policies on paper. States must ensure that these frameworks are effective in practice, meaning that they are enforced, monitored, and updated as needed. This includes providing access to remedy for people harmed by business activities. Use a smart mix of measures. The UNGPs recommend a smart mix of mandatory and voluntary national and international measures. For example, some countries have introduced mandatory human rights due diligence laws that require companies to assess and address risks in their supply chains. These laws help make the regulatory environment more robust and aligned with international standards. Provide access to the following mechanisms: judicial mechanisms, courts, and legal systems where people can file lawsuits or claims. Administrative mechanisms, government bodies or agencies that can investigate complaints or enforce regulations. Legislative mechanisms, laws that create rights and remedies, like compensation or penalties, and ensure that these systems are effective, meaning that they are accessible, fair, and capable of delivering real outcomes for affected individuals or communities. In addition to these obligations of states, all businesses are expected to carry out human rights due diligence. This is how they put their responsibility to respect human rights into practice. What does this mean in real terms? It means that businesses should assess how their activities might impact human rights, take action to prevent or address those impacts, monitor how well those actions are working, communicate openly about what they are doing and what they have learned, and provide for remedy when they have caused or contributed to harm. This can involve actions like apologizing or acknowledging harm, compensating affected people, or changing practices to prevent future harm. For Indigenous peoples, this process is especially important. For example, if a company plans to build infrastructure near Indigenous land, it should assess the risks to Indigenous peoples' rights, for example, their right to cultural heritage, land, and health, and engage meaningfully with the community before moving forward. Businesses have a responsibility to take these actions regardless of whether the country in which they are headquartered or operate in have laws in place that require them to conduct human rights due diligence. Also, it does not matter how big the business is and in which sector or country it operates in. Yet, aspects like the nature and severity of potentially negative human rights impacts that the operations of a business might be involved in, determine how complex this process needs to be. Some UN treaty bodies provide guidance on state obligations in the context of business activities. For example, the UN Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or CESCA, has issued important guidance in this regard. CESCA is a body of independent experts that monitors the implementation of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, or ICESCR, by its state parties. It develops authoritative interpretations to clarify the meaning and application of specific provisions in the Covenant. In 2017, it published a general comment on state obligations in the context of business activities, General Comment number 24. This general comment clarifies that states have obligations when it comes to business activities and human rights. These obligations are defined at 3 levels: to respect, to protect, and to fulfill. The obligation to respect. States must not prioritize business interests over human rights without strong justification. For example, ordering forced evictions to make way for investment projects without consulting indigenous communities violates their rights. This is especially harmful when it affects cultural values and ancestral lands. The obligation to protect. States must actively prevent human rights violations linked to business activities. This means adopting laws, policies, and other measures to ensure that businesses do not harm people's rights, and providing access to remedies when harm occurs. For instance, a government should enforce environmental regulations that prevent pollution of rivers used by indigenous communities for drinking water and fishing. The obligation to fulfill. States must take steps to promote and support the enjoyment of rights, using all available resources. This can include providing essential services, enforcing fair taxation, and working with businesses to uphold human rights standards. For example, a state might partner with indigenous communities and companies to ensure that development projects include access to education, healthcare, and employment opportunities that respect cultural values. Other instruments. In addition to these 2 instruments, there are 2 environmental instruments that focus on procedural rights, including access to information, public participation, and access to justice, which also apply in the context of business activities. The Aarhus Convention is officially called the UNECE Convention on Access to Information, Public Participation in Decision-Making, and Access to Justice in Environmental Matters. The Convention includes the right to know about environmental issues, to participate in decisions that affect you, and to seek justice when your rights are violated in environmental matters. For Indigenous peoples, this means that they should, for example, be fully informed and consulted in decisions about projects like mining or infrastructure that impact their territories. The Escazú Agreement is officially called the Regional Agreement on Access to Information, Public Participation, and Justice in Environmental Matters in Latin America and the Caribbean. the Convention guarantees access to environmental information, participation in decision-making, and justice for affected communities. Crucially, it includes specific protections for environmental human rights defenders, which is especially important for Indigenous leaders and activists. This agreement can help ensure that Indigenous peoples in Latin America and the Caribbean can defend their rights and environment without fear of violence or exclusion. Laws and policies related to preventing and addressing the adverse impacts of business activities on human rights. The surveys ask about human rights-based assessments of laws and policies related to the impacts of business activities on human rights. What are these? They typically include the following: National Action Plans on Business and Human Rights, or BHR-NAPs. Since the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were endorsed in 2011, key actors, including the UN Human Rights Council, the European Union, the Council of Europe, and national human rights institutions, have called on governments to develop business and human rights national action plans, or NAPs. For Indigenous peoples, these plans are an important opportunity to ensure that Indigenous rights are reflected in national laws and policies that regulate business activities, advocate for meaningful participation in the development and implementation of business-related frameworks, and push for stronger protections against human rights and environmental harms caused by business operations on Indigenous lands and territories. For example, Malaysia's draft National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights includes a commitment to implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, or UNDRIP, and legal safeguards for Indigenous rights defenders. National human rights due diligence laws. These laws are increasingly being adopted with the aim of holding companies accountable for human rights and environmental impacts in their global operations and supply chains. They generally require companies to identify and assess risks to human rights and the environment in their operations and value chains, prevent, mitigate, and remedy adverse impacts, engage stakeholders such as affected communities and workers, report on due diligence efforts, establish grievance mechanisms and ensure access to remedy, and face legal liability for harm caused by failure to conduct proper due diligence. Similar to the directives on the EU level, these laws are important for Indigenous peoples as they contain requirements for companies to assess risks to Indigenous rights, land, and cultures. For example, Norway's Transparency Act has explicit references to international human rights instruments, including UNDRIP. Sectoral policies, plans, laws, and frameworks. When assessing the human rights and environmental impacts of business activities, it is important to look beyond general laws and consider sector-specific measures, especially those that affect Indigenous territories, resources, and ways of life. These sectoral measures may relate to industries such as mining, oil and gas, energy, logging, large-scale agriculture, fisheries, parks and protected areas, tourism, and infrastructure projects like roads, ports, and large constructions. These measures can take many forms, such as infrastructure development acts, forest codes, fisheries regulations, tourism policies, or even business and human rights national action plans, or BHR NAPs. This matters for Indigenous peoples because these sectoral frameworks may or may not include human rights and environmental safeguards. Some may overlook Indigenous rights entirely, while others may offer opportunities for protection and participation. National Human Rights and Environmental Impact Assessment laws. These laws can help determine the social, spiritual, cultural, environmental, and broad human rights impacts on Indigenous peoples of proposed business activities. Impact assessments should be conducted in cooperation with Indigenous peoples' representative institutions, and their results should be considered fundamental criteria for the implementation of these activities. An example of impact assessment laws includes Canada's Impact Assessment Act, which covers a broad scope of environmental, health, social, and economic impacts, with explicit attention to Indigenous rights and gender-based analysis. Green energy transition policies. Governments around the world are adopting green transition policies to shift toward more sustainable, low-carbon economies. This includes moving away from fossil fuels and investing in renewable energy sources like solar, wind, and hydropower. Examples include Morocco's Natural Gas Roadmap and Nigeria's Energy Transition Plan. These policies are often framed as climate solutions, but they also have direct implications for Indigenous peoples. This matters to them because renewable energy projects such as wind farms, hydroelectric dams, and solar parks are increasingly being developed on or near Indigenous lands. Without proper consultation and respect for free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC, these projects can lead to land dispossession, cultural disruption, and environmental harm, mirroring the impacts of extractive industries. Green transition policies may also include just transition measures, such as training and employment programs for workers affected by the shift away from fossil fuels. Yet, these often overlook Indigenous peoples unless they are explicitly included in planning and implementation. When reviewing green transition policies using the Human Rights and Environmental Due Diligence module, it is important to assess whether Indigenous peoples were consulted in the development of these policies, whether their rights, knowledge systems, and priorities are reflected, and whether safeguards are in place to prevent harm and ensure benefits are shared equitably. Thank you for joining this video. Please explore the other video tutorials and materials on this page, should you need further guidance in using the surveys and planning capacity building workshops.